Welcome. I'm Iria Puyosa, Senior Research Fellow at the Atlantic Council Democracy and Tech Initiative. Thanks for joining us for the launch of the report Emerging Technology Policies and Democracy in Africa, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and Zambia. The report examines how these African countries are navigating emerging technologies, focusing on connectivity, data governance, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and digital public infrastructure. This report is the result of the work of a team of experts on Africa tech policy: Ayantola Alayande, Samuel Segun, Leah Chong, Fola Adeleke, Selamewit Adela, Rachel Adams, Mark Gaffley, and Fumbi Salami. This research was made possible thanks to the support and partnership of the Embassy of Denmark in Washington, D.C. for our project Inclusive Rights Aligned Approach to Tech Governance. This project encompasses democracy and tech initiative collaboration with African civil society and scholars to address tech governance issues. Today's event will feature a conversation between Aisha Fall, Assistant Director for Francophone Africa at the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and Fola Adeleke, Executive Director at the Global Center on AI Governance, who will present the report highlights. In the second part of the event, African expert Lilian Alwoga, Julie Namfuka, Liz Orembo, Khadijat Elsman, Shidi Venezuela Mutati, and Miriam Beatriz Manjuri will comment on the issues of artificial intelligence and digital public infrastructure policies in Africa. Now, I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Aisha Fall. Thanks.
Greetings, dear audience. I would like to invite Mr. Fola Adeleke, who is the Executive Director for Global Center on AI Governance, but is also the co-author for this report. Good morning, Fola. I would like to direct... Good, and you?
Well, thank you.
My first question to you would be about the report. So this report provides a comprehensive look at the policy landscape for emerging technologies in Africa. As we launch it today, what excites you most about its impact? What are you looking forward to seeing in the month ahead?
Thank you very much. Yes, the report certainly is an exciting one that is being launched today, looking across 3 technology domains. We are looking at connectivity, digital public infrastructure, as well as artificial intelligence. At this crucial stage of understanding how emerging technologies can and should be used on the African continent and how regulation should be shaped and implemented, there are a lot of promising signs and potentials that we discuss in the report. The report looks at 5 African countries: South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia, and Ghana. And one thing that comes out strongly in the report is the fact that in Africa, we've got a youth bulge, right? A large segment of the population will be able to leverage these emerging technologies very creatively and efficiently. In some places in the countries that we reviewed, there's a strong emphasis on research and stakeholder engagement with the inclusion of public holding democratic possibility. In countries like Kenya and Zambia, we are seeing the use of regulatory sandboxes, which could prove useful in allowing innovation while also enabling regulators to assess potential risks and develop appropriate safeguards. As the report that we are launching illustrates, regulatory strategies have to be effective if they are to consider the changing landscape of human technology interactions, allow for ongoing ethical reflections, and crucially ensure an informed decision-making process, informed public dialogue, contingent on increased public awareness of risks, of rights, of the possibilities of the various emerging technologies. What is quite exciting for me is the fact that a lot of the countries are adopting multi-stakeholder approaches to highlight the need for responsible governance while also promoting active public sector engagement for the public good. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that first answer. Now that we know what the report talks about, it also identifies strengths and weaknesses in how African countries approach emerging technologies. Could you elaborate on some common challenges or disparities that need to be addressed? Is there a particularly innovative policy that could lead to positive outcomes?
Thanks. That's a great question. I think firstly, it's important to understand what we mean by emerging technologies in the report. And we kind of define these as technologies that are novel, that are growing at a rapid pace, that show prominent impact, exhibit some coherence in approach, and contain some ambiguity in how they are used. Now, the report examines how 5 African states are embracing the opportunities that the adoption of various technologies presents to solve old problems, given that many still face the grand challenge of digital inclusion across the rural-urban axis. Problems around digital inclusion in relation to gender, education, age, socioeconomic status. And what we try to do is tackle the key policy issues that expand African opportunities in the age of these emerging technologies. So we have classic infrastructure challenges in Africa. Challenges relating to access to power, access to energy, the problems around digital skills gap, and also the fact that policy frameworks emerging on the continent remain fragmented and unimplemented. Most importantly as well, I think public awareness of emerging technology deployment and policy issues are limited because government and private sector conceptions of what should be within these technology domains dominate. So we really have very little knowledge about, public perceptions about these emerging technologies. And for the regulations that have been adopted, there's very limited public capacity in implementation and enforcement. Yet there's high optimism, among these 5 countries about the potential for technologies. I think innovative policy approaches that I imagine perhaps can be linked to what this report does, which shows the value of intercontinental comparisons, rather than looking toward the global north in emphasizing the distinct nature of regulatory environments and experiential overlaps within Africa. It highlights the importance of establishing and tracking local benchmarks, because without them, the particularities of social settings might go unacknowledged, and we'll only be focusing on an evident lack of regulation. So the attraction of employing emerging technologies to address social problems, I believe, is quite evident across the different countries examined, but also at an African Union level. So while I mentioned earlier that we are seeing the utilization of regulatory sandboxes in countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and Zambia, there's also a stronger stakeholder engagement in policy design, right, which presents a particular opportunity to harness the capabilities of our continent's digitally native youth population.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer, helping us identify the strengths and weaknesses. You mentioned it earlier. You talked about the multi-stakeholder approach that African countries have been using. And the report highlights the importance of stakeholder engagement. Can you share insights on how these countries involve various stakeholders in the policymaking processes?
Thank you for that question. The report groups stakeholders into 4 categories. Stakeholders that we believe, should be actively engaged, those that we should keep satisfied, those we should keep informed, and those we should monitor. And the 4 categories represent different levels of stakeholder engagement, right? From actively involving stakeholders to passively observing their behavior across the emerging technology domains. And the various stakeholders we identified are categorized into funders and investment partners, incubators, accelerators, and research institutions, civil society, government, which would include regulators and other agencies, as well as private sector players. Now, in terms of how these countries in the report are involving various stakeholders in policymaking processes, I think I'll speak specifically to South Africa and Nigeria, who have taken a very unique approach in the development of their AI strategies. So in the case of both countries, they actually launched the process of developing their national AI strategies in the same week in April of 2024. And the Nigerian government used AI to identify 120 Nigerians across the globe working in different sectors to come for a 1 week engagement in Abuja to broke them up into different working groups and ask them to develop a draft, AI strategy. And that process of being very deliberate in bringing your experts from within Nigeria and in the diaspora from different sectors, law, engineering, philosophy, computer science, civil society, it truly showed a genuine interest on the part of the government to bring as many stakeholders as possible to have an inclusive process in development of the strategy. And the South African government has largely followed the same approach, but over a longer process. So for the past year, the South African government has also invited, stakeholders from different sectors and placed them in different working groups, focusing on governance and innovation, focusing on regulation, focusing on different aspects of the governance of AI. And over the period of 1 year, has been actively working with them to develop the national AI strategy, which is set to be launched later on this year. And I think that is truly unique in the sense that for arguably the first time in Africa, we are seeing a very deliberate approach on the part of African governments to truly leaning into the expertise that is present in their countries to develop policies and strategies that can really, set them in good stead for the future.
Thank you so much, Fola, for shedding more light on the stakeholder engagement and especially giving us the examples of Nigeria and South Africa and how they have been able to do that. My last question to you would be based on your cross-country analysis. What are some key recommendations or lessons learned that could help African states create more effective and inclusive emerging technology policies while safeguarding democratic values?
Thank you for that. I think it's quite important to acknowledge that policy discussions on emerging technologies in Africa have largely focused on their potential to drive industrialization, to drive innovation, for green transition, for economic growth on the continent. And research on the impact of technologies is also replete with an economic framing, especially with their potential to accelerate Africa's industrialization ambitions. And one thing that is consistent from the research that we did is that currently Africa is witnessing a growing adoption of forms of technologies more rapidly than it did in the post-independence era. But such rapid adoption has a significant impact on Africa's democracy. Beyond being a tool for good, for example, to enable public service efficiency, to improve government-citizen communications, to increase citizen participation, these emerging technologies can also widen inequality, enable the spread of disinformation, enable new forms of human rights oppression. And the research approaches on emerging technology on the continent generally tend to be optimistic, glossing over these structural, political, sociocultural barriers and the inhibitors of progress in these specific technology domains. But the advent of artificial intelligence has somewhat widened the scope of emerging technologies research on the continent, bringing with it a growing awareness of the socio-political impact of technologies beyond the economic promise. So we are seeing new research that's talking about the potential of AI to cause harm, including just the displacement, including bias and prejudice, including risks to human rights. And all of this is happening within the context of low digital literacy levels. So how do we create more efficient and inclusive emerging technology policies while safeguarding democratic values? I think we've got to focus on tackling the challenges I already mentioned, especially issues around digital literacy and a growing digital divide. This needs to be addressed through public and private sector action. For example, we have regulatory bodies like human rights commissions, data protection authorities that are not all created equal. The Human Rights Commission and Data and Information Regulator in South Africa certainly has more resources than the Human Rights Commission and Data Protection Regulator in Ghana. And in a continent where personal data has been incredibly commodified, we are to use the example of fintech, where Africans are being placed in perpetual cycle of death through mobile lending applications that grants predatory lenders unprecedented access to people's personal data. We need to focus not just on the protection and enforcement and monitoring mandates of these regulatory bodies, but we also need to focus on their promotion mandates and support them in that, creating public education campaigns that makes people aware of the risks of using some of these technologies, some of these products, the importance of protecting your own rights, your own privacy, and how to seek redress when you believe those rights have been violated. This needs financial support from governments to adequately resource these agencies. It needs civil society to support the mandates of these agencies in developing these education campaigns. It needs the private sector to be more accountable to existing laws and regulations and making sure that we have a very clearly defined redress mechanism, accessible redress mechanism in place when some of these rights are violated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fola, for setting the stage and giving us your insights on the report. We have noted the challenges you spoke about in terms of the emerging technologies in Africa, and some of them are about infrastructure, the others are about the lack of digital skills, digital literacy, and you have also told us about the multi-stakeholder approach that some of the African countries have had and which have been successful. And you told us also about how to create more inclusive policies. Thank you so much. I would like to now move on with the discussion with our esteemed panelists. I would like to start with Lilian Nalwoga, Program Manager at CIPESA. Hello, Lilian. Good morning.
Morning. Oh, it's afternoon, evening.
Good afternoon, evening. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
My question to you, Lilian, we spoke of artificial intelligence earlier, while Fola was giving his insights. So in light of the increasing deployment of AI applications and DPI systems, what strategies can be adopted to integrate privacy by design principles from the outset? How can developers and policymakers ensure that these technologies are developed and used in a manner that respects and protects personal data?
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you for having me at this very thoughtful discussion. I listened, I read the report, very, very insightful on what's happening in the continent. More specific to this question, I like the part where it mentions that any key aspect, whether it comes to anything that is being deployed, whether it's DPI systems or AI applications, we need to look at regulation, regulation and enabling legal and regulatory frameworks. And I think in this report, there's an aspect that has been mentioned about regulatory sandboxes that are, allowing innovation and that kind of thing. So on the concept of privacy by design, I think when it comes to this, when it comes to deploying this AI or DPI, it is one of those things that has to be at the forefront. Because one is these have to be designed in a manner that, you're preventing, privacy evasions, there's consent, that data subject is aware of what is happening in regard to their data. The systems are in place, the privacy systems are in place when it comes to data collection or handling or management. And right now, if I take it back to the issue of regulation, we've seen that privacy by design is being pocketed in a few aspects of regulations. Some countries do have aspects of, in Africa, and I think in some of the countries that we are seeing, there's no particular kind of say when it comes to DPI, no particular legal framework that is governing that, but we are seeing pockets of this that are enabling, the privacy by design concept. Whether it is in data protection, personal data protection, whether it is in deploying national IDs, for instance. I'll take that as an example because I think this is one of the most common way we are seeing DPI systems coming around. Privacy has to be embedded in a manner that, the user knows where their data is coming from, where it's going to be used, and that kind of thing. So from the onset, these have to be integrated. And I think we saw aspects, I think a case in Kenya where there was a lot of pushback from the community on how the digital ID, the national digital ID was being deployed. And I think that led to government to reconsider the human rights aspects, and this was the privacy issue. So I think in terms of strategies, I've talked about the privacy by default, which has to be asserted. The other aspect, the issue of consent, yes, I know some of these, say, systems, say DPI, AI is a bit tricky because at times there's really not so much consent from the users on how, they use AI on them. But I think one aspect when it comes to privacy by design, we need to look at granular consent right from the start. A user has to give, specific and permissions for use of their data, under what conditions. And again, this can also be tackled in terms of, of the law, ensuring that is put in force at the design aspect, but also at the implementation aspect that goes through. The other one maybe we can look at when looking at deploying AI and DPI systems is the end-to-end encryption, and systems have to be designed in a way that, there's that less kind of, intrusion. Data has to be decrypted. You would not want to go having, your data, for instance, now that we are so much on using national IDs and all your information is in a whole page, being given out there. So that is one thing that we can look at. Also, there's the aspect of digital signatures. Digital signatures, these have to be able to verify the authenticity or the integrity of digital messages or documents. So again, this is an aspect that has to be embedded right from the design of these platforms, whether it's AI or DPI. And of course, the other aspect would be the use of verifiable credentials. And I think this may be one of the other things that we've seen a lot of pushback, especially when it comes to DPI deployment in most African countries, because I think we had aspects where people, either you're using your eye, iris, or you're using your thumb, and there are aspects of that some people may not be able to use their thumb. So if they're not able to, then they should be able to use a different method where you verify that this is actual the user and the code and all that. So that is on the first question. On the other, how can developers and policymakers ensure that technologies are developed in a manner that respects and protects personal data? The one thing I think that I can focus on or maybe push for is engagements. Right from the start, we will look at, because the private sector does provide the systems, and then the government is either ensuring that enforcement is happening in terms of, say, legal policy regulations. But right before a system is developed, I think there needs to be a lot of stakeholder engagements, government engaging private sector right from the start to understand, to give them the actual needs of the system, what they want, but also should not stop at private sector or in this case, the developers or the policymakers, but there has to be this wider public consultation in terms of what ideal system would you want to see when it comes to your data collection or your protection of your data. So I think the one aspect that I need that I can push or focus on is on the issue of very wide stakeholder engagements, consultations when it comes to developing the deployment of these new technologies. So I'll stop at that. I'm happy to jump in case there are any other things that feel exciting to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you. You have shed more light on how we can integrate privacy by design principles in emerging technologies, and the importance of collaboration between the government, who are setting the policies, and the private sector, who are also working on these technologies, as well as public engagement. I would like to now move to Juliette Nanfuka, who is a Research and Communications Officer at CIPESA. Good afternoon, Juliette. So,
Yes.
Juliette, yes, my question to you is still about artificial intelligence. And given the varying stages of AI national strategy development across African countries, from South Africa ramping up plans to Zambia recently launching its strategy, what key factors should be prioritized to ensure these strategies contribute to economic development without exacerbating inequalities?
Great. Thank you, and congratulations to the Atlantic Council on the release of this report. It's been quite insightful, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. So a lot of what I'm saying is echoing what was spoken earlier by Fola, and also touched upon by Lillian, and some of the issues that we are seeing when it comes to the progression of AI strategies within the continent is around capacity, skills, and basic understanding of what AI is. Something as basic as privacy is taken for granted by some, is something that is not thought about by others, especially in countries where our privacy is deemed as something that belongs to somebody else in some instances. Our privacy is not necessarily guaranteed, but as Lillian has pointed out, privacy by design is something that is a necessity, but also something that requires some level of basic digital awareness, basic digital literacy when it comes to navigating digital spaces. So digital literacy does not barely only refer to how to navigate a tool, how to navigate online spaces, but also how to understand the intricacies of being in the digital society when it comes to issues such as privacy, when it comes to issues such as misinformation, disinformation. How well aware are users of the internet and the emerging tools of these complexities? So
I think Juliet is having a bit of connectivity issues. Juliet, can you hear us? Okay. While she comes back, we'll be moving on with the next panelist. So we have Liz Orembo, who is a researcher at Research ICT Africa. Good afternoon, Liz.
Good afternoon.
Good to see you. So my question to you would be, what can be done to ensure that digital public infrastructure systems deployed in Africa, especially those involving digital identification and biometric data, can be designed and implemented with robust privacy and security measures to prevent surveillance, discrimination, and exclusion?
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you for to the organizers for this report and for this event. I think that's a very important question, especially with the deployment of DPIs and DPIs being marketed as the most effective technology right now for government efficiency and services. But then I think in most cases, especially where there's been pushback in Africa, we've tended to divorce issues of democratic governance and technology itself. When deploying technology, we should follow the same principles of governance. Things like privacy, human rights, things like equal distribution of resources, and not leaving anyone behind with such deployment of such essential services to citizens. I'll just borrow from some of the speakers what they've said, and also part of the report. Data protection principles should be in place and more robustly when deploying digital public infrastructure. And it's because it's a right, it's a human right itself. So when deploying these technologies, we need to make sure that the data protection principles are in place. Principles such as specificity of purpose, the different programs within the different public infrastructure, be it payment systems, be it different government programs themselves, and be it even managing or processing data that is coming out of digital public infrastructure. They should have purpose specification, not just data being used with any purpose that comes to mind just because you have the data, that then you can use it for multiple purposes. There also needs to be design for necessity, and design for necessity also encompasses that any solution that you're deploying or providing with the digital public infrastructure, it needs to be necessary. You need to explain if you're borrowing from another program. So let's say that the digital ID, most countries have digital IDs, but then why do we need a digital ID and a digital public infrastructure? You need to explain why you need it. What components does it have that the normal ID systems doesn't have? Because you're also using taxpayers' money to bring out some of these tech solutions. The other thing, inclusion of all citizens. It's a right. The non-digital ID is a right and is open for all citizens. As you move to the technological aspects of it, you need to ensure that it's inclusive. And these rights, the data protection rights, are also inclusive, not just not just given to certain citizens or certain users, and other citizens, you can't apply the same standards of governance system. So in most of the cases, in some of the cases that we've seen in Africa, and especially in my country, is that some of the challenges that we've seen with the digital, the non-digital ID, the analog ID, they've been lifted to the digital public infrastructure, the ID layer of it. So when going, as we are praising digital public infrastructure, the biometric IDs for government efficiency, for inclusion and all that, we must ensure that some of these protections that were not included in the physical IDs, they are actually rectified coming to technological front. Making my answer shorter, I think it goes without saying that we also need strong encryption standards with digital public infrastructure and digital IDs. Strong cybersecurity measures, strong policies, and institutions to kind of manage or mediate some of the challenges that are going to come with the digital IDs. My second last point would be using independent audits, because sometimes these are closed systems deployed by government, sometimes also in non-inclusive way, in a way that there's no multi-stakeholder participation. So we need to ensure that these processes are democratic, and being democratic means that you open them up for citizen participation and stakeholder participation. It needs to be explainable, so that you empower the citizens in how these systems work, how they are protected, and if their rights are violated, how they can go about it with the mediating institutions. The other thing is independent audit involving multi-stakeholders, including academia, to do research and development on how to protect human rights with this in this infrastructure, and also evaluation, the audits themselves, to see what are the gaps for human rights safeguards exist in these deployments, and how can they be improved over time. Sometimes, or most of the time with these technologies, is that we don't deploy them while they are 100% robust or 100% efficient. It's a matter of continuous learning. We deploy and we continue to learn. So when we close these systems from participation from other stakeholders, then we miss out on the opportunities for learning on how to protect users. And if we open them up, they also afford us public trust. So that when there's public concerns about a number of things, then we can have non-partisan parties from civil society and even academia coming up to say that we actually audited this system, and these are the concerns that are coming, or they can demystify some of these concerns. I would also like to say, maybe as a last point to insist on that multi-stakeholder participation, is that some of these tools, and especially when technology is used for elections management, a lot of misinformation come up because people don't understand how technology is being deployed or how it's being used. So a lot of attacks on this information comes from elections management from tech use. And if we open those systems up, actually, we can have non-partisan groups speaking out for public interest and actually educating the public or getting them more involved in some of these technology and democratic processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you for shedding more light on how digital public infrastructures can be put in place, especially telling us about the need for necessity, also inclusivity, and the need for audits and strong policies put in place for these technologies. I would like to come back to Juliet, who was telling us about AI national strategies and how they can contribute to economic development. Juliet, are you back with us?
Yes, thank you. And my apologies for going offline. I think this is actually true to the response I was trying to give, considering the different stages of national AI development strategy development that we are sitting on as a continent. Some countries are further ahead than others. Prime example was here, where we are still struggling with stable internet connectivity or connections, even in 2025. But yeah, so how ready are we for using AI as a tool for economic development when some of the basics of infrastructure are still questionable? All this speaks to the digital ecosystem readiness, basic infrastructure services, basic digital literacy access and awareness, as I had started alluding to earlier. And this conversations are particularly important as we anticipate more is yet to come. We are having these discussions and doing this work because Africa's population is quite young. And even as all of this is happening right now, what we're essentially doing is future-proofing the digital society for the younger generation that is perhaps going to use the internet in ways that we cannot even begin to imagine. One interesting stat I read was that by 2030, some 42% of the young population entering the workforce will be from the African continent. So these strategies are speaking to a future that has lots of potential if we go about it well, and that includes ensuring that the basic infrastructure services are sustainable, they are reliable, they are affordable, and that goes even back to something as basic as a home. It goes back to how, at a broader level, our government systems or business structures allowing for the necessary economic levels of economic accesses or affordances to help this realization of that 42% of the population of Africa's population that I mentioned earlier. But anyway, so when we come to talk about AI national strategies and the readiness in ensuring that we are getting to a point that is globally competitive activity, which for some countries remains particularly high. And in some contexts, when countries are talking about AI readiness, they're not even thinking about issues such as affordability. That's how far ahead they are. Yet in the continent, we are grappling with those at different levels in different parts of the country. And that goes back to something that was also pointed out quite repeatedly in the report, the Global Index on Responsible AI. Where do countries sit on this spectrum? A lot of African countries are barely making a blip there, but some countries have indicated some levels of responsiveness. And these are countries with higher economic performance, higher internet connectivity. Of course, these are countries like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa that have performed quite well on that index. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have countries that barely have any data to show what is happening in their contexts. We have countries that are still struggling with basic connectivity issues, even though some of them are located along the coast. For example, the landing sites are right there to the global internet actual infrastructure, but getting data to see how they are, where they are in the greater scheme of things is difficult. So Africa's context is quite unique when it comes to assessing AI national strategy development. But nonetheless, efforts are being made as far back as 2018, when Mauritius launched their AI strategy, and more recently to when Zambia released their national AI strategy in December 2024. So work is happening, and this is in tandem with frameworks such as the Continental AI Strategy by the African Union, which when you look at these strategies, all speaking similar languages, speaking to the need for innovation, the need for digital inclusion, the need for economic enhancement, which is what this question is actually speaking to. how do we get to a point where we are utilizing these strategies to contribute to economic development without exacerbating inequalities, many of which exist. But in conclusion, to try to get to those points, we need to consider more greatly how we pursue stakeholder engagement in the development of these strategies. At a continental level, we're seeing a struggle there. How well versed are the people contributing? How much of a contribution is actually absorbed when it comes to the development of these strategies at a continental level, but by extension at a national level? Are we getting enough of the right stakeholders participating in consultations? Or is there a weighting towards some groups than others? Are we getting enough of African technologists, for example, involved in those discussions? Are we getting enough contribution from the ordinary user who ultimately are going to face the consequences for poorly designed AI strategy? How well involved is this segment are these different segments of the population? Those are questions we need to be asking. Alongside that, and what Kola spoke to was resource allocation. We have quite a lot of multilateral investment into African policy development. But how much are we as African states contributing to some of these strategies? Are we waiting to be told when and what to do? So those are some of the questions that we need to be really thinking hard about or pushing for as civil society in some aspects. Let's start this from within, as opposed to being told, now you can start. We also need to look at basic issues such as infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, infrastructure remains, we keep talking about last mile connectivity, but there are segments of some countries which are still grappling with basic speeds, with basic access. So this spectrum on which the continent is sitting when it comes to technology is varied. So there's some subtleties that will emerge in some of the strategies that are developed, and we to be aware of that and appreciate them, but nonetheless remain with a harmonious language in our AI strategies. We also need to ultimately go back to basic literacy. How much training are we investing, or is part of the language of the AI strategies? Is it something that is written up and not actually is it something that looks good on paper but has a heavy cost that we actually cannot afford? But what does that exclusion based on finance mean for data colonialism, or the new age of colonialism that we are risking because of some of these exclusions? What does that mean for bias in some of the language or the tools that are emerging in this age of technology? So those are some of the questions that some of these AI strategies need to be speaking to. And it's good to see that the report touches on quite a lot of this. So please do read the report. It's quite exciting. But ultimately, we need to also consider that in the various countries, we have different opportunities available. South Africa is looking for responsible workforce using AI. A country with more agriculture look for the deployment of AI in their tools. So those are the subtleties that we need to be considering in our AI strategies and utilizing those strategies to speak a language that supports economies while not, perpetuating the current inequalities that exist, including at a gender level, a language level, and the various inequalities that have persisted in the digital age that we are trying to grapple with. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you for bringing our attention to the basic challenges that we are facing as a continent. I would like to now move to Khadija Usman, who is the program manager at Paradigm Initiative. Hello, Khadija, can you hear me? Hi, nice to have you here. So we have spoken about digital skills as a challenge so far. So considering the identified gaps in digital skills and education across the African countries, what specific and actionable strategies can be implemented to better prepare African youth for the meaningful use of emerging technologies and for participation in the AI industry?
Okay, thank you, Aisha, and thank you to everyone for your insightful commentary so far. I do think there's a mistake with my portfolio over there. Not a manager quite yet, but I imagine that is, soon to come. I want to piggyback off of some of the things that Juliet had mentioned. When she spoke about AI strategies, she mentioned how seemingly some of the more foundational stuff that states should be focusing on are they're just not existent. And one of the things, like you've mentioned in your question, is digital skills. You would find that if you even look around on social media, especially when people see governments making commentary on we're bringing out an AI strategy, a lot of the commentary from the ordinary folk is this what we should be focusing on? We're thinking about internet affordability and stuff like that. But I'm here to say we can do both, right? So while and this is focusing on something that the report said, a comprehensive multi-stakeholder approach. So when we're talking about digital skills development, and even in addition, AI education, we want to incorporate AI emerging technologies into the usual national curricula of schools. So we can then find that the curriculums that are being used in schools, primary, secondary schools, should be constantly improving. It should integrate AI, data science, digital skills training into all of this foundational understanding at an early age. And we see this in other developed economies happening. Ideally, we should also see an expansion in technical and vocational training, establishing AI-focused vocational programs and partnerships with the private sector or with private sector tech hubs to provide a hands-on experience. And in certain cases, certifications as well. Something that states can also focus on is promoting research and innovation labs. We've seen something similar in South Africa with the AI Institute, and something smaller but similar in Nigeria's National Center for Artificial Intelligence and Robotics, just to encourage innovation and local talent development. Another thing that would be great to see would be public-private partnerships that help prepare the workforce. So we see that a lot of the private sector usually have their corporate social.
The sound from Khadija.
Yeah.
Khadija,
are you? Okay. Well, I can hear you, but it seems you cannot hear me.
Now we can hear you.
I have no idea where you lost me. But just 2 seconds. The infrastructure over here is not great, in case you're wondering. I'm in Nigeria. So just moving forward, I was talking about how we can do more when it comes to, or private sector can do more with their corporate social responsibilities. We'd see some of them implementing, say, boreholes or scholarships for students. We can do more in terms of incorporating internships or apprenticeship programs that prepare students for real-world technology applications, supporting of AI startups. We also saw that Nigeria has recently passed a National Startup Act. Implementation is always a problem, but that is in itself a good place to start. But also industry-led certification programs. We're using the technologies of the likes of Google, Microsoft, and more local startups. So why don't they also provide free or subsidized training for youth? I think it was Juliet or Liz that spoke a bit about digital infrastructure and inclusion initiatives we have to go back to the basics, increasing broadband access, investing in data centers, cloud infrastructure, things that can actually carry the technology we say we want to or get to. We're also looking at inclusion, right? Gender inclusion, rural inclusion. We want to ensure that the special needs of marginalized groups are tended to as we move towards the Africa of our dreams. But also as we do this, I think I also heard Juliet mention this, and I'm thinking we're all aligned when it comes to our thoughts. So as we do develop these policies and integrate them into our national curriculums, we want to ensure that in the development of them, they're ethical. As we bring these national strategy frameworks and implement them broadly, we want to ensure that they are human-centric. They have responsible data governance. They foster collaboration. And I think that is a good place to pause. Just, a multi-stakeholder approach that involves government, private sector, academia, ensuring that youth are equipped with digital skills to meaningfully engage emerging technologies in the AI industry. We don't necessarily need to focus on one or the other, especially with how quickly technology is moving these days, but we want to ensure that the African continent can position itself as a competitive force in the digital economy. So I think I can pause here.
Thank you so much, Khadija. Thank you for telling us about the intersection between education and emerging technologies and the need also for creating an environment that favors innovation. Thank you. Now I would like to move on to Chiti Mutati, who is the Programs Officer at Paradigm Initiative. Hello, Chiti. Hi, good to see you. So my question to you will be about some challenges. So the report mentions potential human rights risks and vulnerabilities associated with digital public infrastructure, such as surveillance and discrimination. What are the key challenges in ensuring that DPI projects in Africa are implemented responsibly with robust privacy and security measures, and how can these challenges be addressed proactively?
Okay, thank you. So I think, a lot of the discussions around the region's DPI journey have focused very much on the opportunities, right? So improved governance, improved public service delivery, and the economic benefits. But I think the human-centered and rights-impacting elements of DPI have largely been left out of the conversation or glossed over, of course, outside of the broader civil society space, policy advocacy space. But a human and inclusion-centered, rights-respecting approach to DPI forms the basis of the DPI lifecycle and DPI deployment. It actually shouldn't come about at the expense of increased risks to human rights. So in terms of some of the main challenges, look, I think that the relationship between responsible DPI and political will can't be understated, right? A government's willingness to prioritize human rights and equitable inclusion within DPI is a key factor in enabling responsible DPI to thrive. So in countries where there has already been a poor human rights record, then it does follow on that DPI adoption can then open the doors for newer and deeper types of human rights violations. I think the policy and regulatory environment, it's already been touched on, before me, but it's crucial, and it's crucial in areas such as, privacy, freedom of expression, access to information. So responsible DPI can't abound in countries where there is a lacuna in terms of these legislations, or where there are, or where these legislations exist, but there are challenges in the provisions of laws such as cybersecurity and data protection. I think responsible DPI has also been challenged by a lack of public trust, which further runs the risk of unequal participation and benefit from the digital economy. And then that will then deepen the inequality despite the adoption of DPI in the country. So in terms of how these can be addressed in a proactive way, I think in the first need a much more active role in our region's DPI journey, right? So this will require public literacy, public awareness, and public participation in topics ranging from, what are the planned DPI projects in a country by a government? What are the regulations and policies around DPI? And also, what are the real life impacts of deployments within our societies? And I think civil society as well, we're poised to play a really, really crucial role in advocating for adequate standards and safeguards across all stages of the DPI lifecycle. So we also have to make sure that our capacity and our skills and knowledge and even how we collaborate with one another around these issues is at a good level, right? And then, on the collaboration end, the collaboration then needs to extend out to governments, and other stakeholders around DPI adoption in the region. I think I'd also say we need more responsiveness and transparency around the DPI life cycle. So, ranging from transparency around procurement of technologies, who are the vendors, who are the players who are involved in a particular project, what is the monitoring and evaluation around this, and how quickly are governments responding to the impacts of certain technologies on citizens. And then obviously from a regulation and policy perspective, definitely a lot more needs to be done around advocacy and policy influence, particularly on provisions which, when coupled with DPI, will provide, unfettered powers to the surveillance, or where there's no kind of clarity around the protection of these vast amounts of data that will be collected of citizens. And so, yeah, the focus on advocating for and ensuring the implementation of laws which align with international human rights laws and standards. And then, as was actually mentioned before me, also a focus on standalone DPI policies and agendas, which are, clear and measurable and actionable within the context of being human-centered and focused on human rights.
Thank you so much, Chiti, for especially telling us about the importance of awareness and transparency in DPI and presenting the civil society as a key actor. I would like to now move on to our last but not least panelist, Miriam Wanjiru, who is a programs officer from Paradigm Initiative. It's nice to have you here, Miriam.
Thank you, Aisha. Nice to see you again.
Great. So the report suggests that policy discourses on emerging technologies in Africa tend to focus on economic growth, sometimes overshadowing social-political impacts. How can African nations balance harnessing AI's economic potential and mitigating risks to democracy, human rights, and social equity?
Thanks, Aisha. I've been strictly asked to stick to 3 minutes, so I'll spend just 1 minute really appreciating the research, because I really enjoyed reading the research, and I'm not just saying that because I was invited to speak. I actually really did, and I think people should as well. And a couple of things that stood out for me that I'd just like to point out is the matrix that has been developed, and it's part of the annex. One, because we have very limited data, particularly coming from the African continent, on how AI policy is shaping up on the continent. And I think it's a huge, huge resource for academia, civil society, even governments. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And there's also a stakeholder map which I think is absolutely brilliant. I would actually request that the authors make it, turn it to a resource that can be updated, because AI and AI policy is shifting so fast. For instance, when you're looking at Kenya, it does not mention the AI strategy, obviously because it is not out, but it will be out in the next coming weeks. So that needs to be updated. So if there's a way that this resource can be turned to something that can be updated every so often, I think it would be a perfect resource. But I also really enjoyed, just reading through the idea of regulatory sandboxes. The last time I had this concept, I was in policy school, which was many years back. And I'm glad that we are now beginning to have a discussion about that, right? And just looking at policy and policy making as a science, because it is a science, and a very sensitive issue like AI and particularly emerging technologies. I think we need to embrace more the idea of regulatory sandboxes. But lastly, I think I was also pretty impressed that at least more people are looking at regulation as a solution, and it's not being frowned upon. And people who frown upon regulation, I completely understand. But for us to start shifting the mindset from regulation as the enemy to it's just setting standards in the sector, and I think that was really commendable. Back to your question, how do we balance the economic aspect or the economic gains with democratic safeguards and human rights? And just to begin by saying that we should not entirely demonize how governments are picking up AI as a solution to our economic problems, right? There's a place for that. But I think what you're asking is how do we then balance? Because if we go the economic way, then we may lose out very critical and important aspects of human rights, and reinforce inequalities, data exploitation, and authoritarian digital governance models, which is a critical analysis and a perfect analysis. So then, how do we do that? I think, and I'll borrow from a few examples that I have seen elsewhere. I think one of it is developing frameworks that prioritize human rights. I could give an example with even the EU Act, which is a regulation. It's more regulation than a policy because it's legally binding. But I think I'm actually a fan of the EU Act because it looks at or analyzes artificial intelligence from a risk assessment point of view. So you analyze how risky a particular solution when deploying, when coming up with it, how risky in terms of human rights is it? So that's just one framework. And I'd also like to give an sort of like example that I have seen elsewhere. So we have in Kenya, I'm Kenyan, I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. Our Data Protection Act, which again is a regulation, requires that entities, businesses, governments, go through a data protection impact assessment. And I think it has been mentioned here, the Huduma number case, for those of you who have been following, was actually thrown out on basis of the government did not follow through the impact assessment. So if it's a model we can carry forward in terms of emerging technologies and particularly AI, just ensuring that before deployment, testing, and all that, then we have an assessment that can ensure that issues around democracy and human rights are not completely lost. That would be perfect. So I think a last solution to ensuring that we do not lose that aspect. And I will give an example with. So I actually submitted comments to the proposed AI strategy, the Kenyan AI strategy. It is not out yet, but one of the gaps I identified in that particular document is that it leaves out, these principles that we are talking about. And personally, one of the suggestions I was giving is perhaps put together an independent AI governance and ethics committee. I think Mauritius has done something similar. There's a council that just looks at the ethics and human rights and governance principles to AI, so that it wholesomely looks at the AI policy landscape within a country. Fingers crossed that they actually adopt it. And also a solution that I gave particularly to the Kenyan strategy is ensuring that we have a link and we're not looking at all these policies and strategies in isolation. So in the strategy, again, I hope they will revise, but there was no mention and there was no link to the national strategy and how it links to global frameworks, because we have plenty of frameworks. So like the UNESCO AI ethics recommendation, we have the, even GDC at some point mentions that. We have a few guidelines by the UN. So how there's a separation in how that links to the global standard. So as I wrap up, I think we can navigate and balance that by ensuring we have sustainable governance frameworks and human rights frameworks, and if possible, put together an independent committee, ethics committee, and human rights committee, just to ensure that we balance that out with the provisions of the economic provisions. Lastly, this wasn't part of the question, but please allow me to just mention a little bit, because I've had a few people talk about multi-stakeholderism in AI policy making, which is fantastic. And I'm basing my discussion on a study that we conducted last year at Paradigm Initiative. So we were just looking at the extent to which multi-stakeholderism is employed in AI policy making. Multi-stakeholderism, public participation, depending on how you want to call it. And while we are proponents of public participation and multi-stakeholderism, we also need to determine and define the threshold to which proper multi-stakeholderism and proper public participation entails. I'll give an example. So if you bring together 9 people, one is from academia, the other one is from civil society, so that would be me, for example, and then we bring someone from government and put them together in a room and say this is a multi-stakeholder process, and we have involved different stakeholders in the making of XYZ policy document. I don't think that cuts it. And if we report it as, we are being, or rather the body is being, implementing, public participation, then it doesn't really cut it. And that's why, again, I'm also quite a fan of the EU Act, because it sort of puts the burden on, say, the regulator or the government to train and to ensure people actually understand what AI is all about and AI policy making, and then they can contribute to the process. So I think we need to define the threshold, what multi-stakeholderism actually means, because currently it's just a fancy thing people are saying. If you say public participation, we call people. So what does that actually mean? How does that look like moving forward to ensure that multiple voices have been put, or have been consulted in the making of future policies.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Thank you for telling us more about how we can actually cross-check the frameworks before even deployment, and ensuring that there is a balance between these technologies and their socio-political implications. Now, I believe this has been a rich and insightful discussion. Before we wrap up, I'd like to invite each one of you to share one final thought, perhaps a key takeaway or a call to action. Let's please keep it to 1 minute each. I will start with Chiti.
Thank you, Aisha. No, I'd really like to say thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this event, and for a really, really insightful, widely encompassing report. And I think mine would be a call to action. I think I touched on it earlier about the importance of collaboration and knowledge sharing, particularly within the civil society space, so that can enable us to then go on to bring about the necessary public awareness or support the necessary public awareness and public sensitization that is required as we increase the adoption of emerging technologies. And so I think reports like this are a really crucial part of that, and sharing them widely and disseminating them widely is very important. So thank you once again, and it was a real pleasure to hear everyone's thoughts as well.
Thank you very much, Chiti. I would like to give the virtual mic to Juliet. Juliet, you're muted.
I seem to be having
she's there. I was just saying that I echo everything that you were saying in my excitement. Yeah, so congratulations once again. I think my contribution would be that in order to evolve as a continent, we need to pay particular respect to our homegrown solutions or context that we're coming from. And earlier, we have centers, we have research bodies that are doing quite a bit of work into trying to understand this landscape of emerging technologies. We have in the National Center for AI and Robotics. In South Africa, there is Masakane, which is looking at natural language processing and how to get that into the broader global discourse. So in different countries, there's quite a lot happening, but connecting more between what is happening at such spaces to policy discourse and development and framework development is something that I think we have a great opportunity to make our frameworks a whole lot more robust and more responsive to our dynamics.
Thank you very much, Juliet. I will now give the hand to Lillian for your closing remarks.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you to Atlantic Council for having for having majority of ladies as panelists. I was going to say a whole panel of ladies, but then I realized there are two men somewhere around. Yeah, so this is a very, very insightful report, and to me, starting from the aspect that it starts with policy development, ensuring that everyone is on board, ensuring that all the different aspects are in place. It's not just a cut and paste, and that is what probably we are seeing, and that's where the problems are starting from. We should ensure that policies are inclusive, they're taking into aspects of privacy for the developers of the private sector, but also I think someone mentioned about the issue of stakeholder engagement, consultations. This, in most cases, when it comes to technology, most cases, private sector is not well consulted. And that is something that needs to be looked into and re-emphasized for us to ensure that we have inclusive enabling technologies in the deployment of AI and the DPI systems. I think my 1 minute is on top. Thank you. But thank you for a wonderful report.
Thank you. Thank you. So I will now hand over to Khadija for her last remarks.
Thank you, Aisha. So I think something that stands out is how Africa is at a pivotal moment in its digital transformation journey. There's so much potential that is coming up to harness emerging technologies, to do better with artificial intelligence, the data governance, in order for us to drive economic growth, social inclusion, and human rights protections in Chiti's voice. We've spoken a bit about the multi-stakeholder approach, but I just wanted to highlight the need to invest in digital skills, specifically using the structures that we have that are existing already, which will be schools, ensuring that Also, we want to make sure that in our spaces of influence, we work to strengthen AI governance, ensure inclusive connectivity, and of course, I mean, based on the demographic of those here, uphold fundamental rights. The road ahead of us requires collaboration and long-term strategic planning, and I look forward to seeing how we would all contribute to influencing this space. And of course, read the report. Read the report.
Thank you so much, Khadija. I think we can all agree that we have had a few of those words and ideas that come through again and again, like multi-stakeholder engagement, public participation, the role of civil society, and also inclusivity. I would like to now move over to Miriam, who just spoke to us about governments and how they can ensure also that they insert they can use some approaches in their frameworks before deployment.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I will spend my 1 minute and thank the organizers. One, because you are part of a few people who are curating African-centered AI knowledge. There's still a huge gap. You're helping to bridge the gap between policymakers, technologists, advocates, citizens, which is really, really commendable. I look forward to more output from your end. And, you know, I've learned so much. And my call to action to policymakers, let us be consultative and, you know, meaningful participation, meaningful multi-stakeholderism. And for us guys in civil society, let us continue to be louder and more persistent and more annoying to champion for digital rights, you know, and inclusive policy making. But thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And I'm sure that Ilya has taken note of that with the DTI. And I will now give the mic to Liz, who spoke to us earlier about DPIs.
Yes, thank you, Aisha. I'd like to give my end remarks on data governance, and especially for public interest AI, and also democratic AI. Most of the strategies being developed, be it African Union strategy, country strategies, are focused on economic development of AI, which is very an encouraging thing, because the number one need for Africa is human prosperity, and but some of it comes from economic development. But you also tend to forget the social and the civic use of AI. And an example, during the Kenyan protest, there's a lot of use of AI to engage people on policies, to engage them on domestic governance and all that. And there's a big role for civil society in the usage of data, and to also incorporating AI to make sure that people are being communicated to in a way that they can understand. You know, policy language is usually very technical, and especially tech policy is usually very technical. But AI can be used to meet people at their different levels of needs or their different levels of understanding. And that's one thing that we learned from that demonstration, the Gen Z demonstration. But the challenge is we don't have data, rightly said in the report as well. And sometimes even where we don't have data, it's being stored in silos. People are not, as stakeholders cannot access this data. A lot of governance issues that can be fed into AI for participatory governance are being locked even within policies themselves, the challenges of policies themselves, where access to information policies are not being implemented as they ought to be, or even in some cases we've we've gotten to an approach of governing data from our narrow approach of data protection. Instead of categorizing data, giving that modular governance to data, where it's of public interest, then we ensure that it's out there to serve the society, and where necessary rights and safeguards need to be accorded to data, or it's also protected within the institutions that the data is being held. So that is my remark, that data in Africa, and also calling for data that is being held by foreign companies, foreign tech companies. Africa uses a lot of foreign tech, and that means that a lot of our data is being stored outside. What are those partnerships that we can have to make sure that this data is also accessible? So both foreign and domestic, and also calling for AI development and the civil society capacity building to democratize AI for civic purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, for highlighting also accessibility and relatability. As you talked about the Gen Z protests, which have happened in Kenya, have also happened, we did not call it Gen Z, but also happened in Senegal. So just seeing how AI also contributes to this information, but also is an active part of our daily lives. I will now give the final word to Fola as the author of the co-author of the report for his closing remarks.
Thank you so much. So I want to firstly acknowledge my colleagues who wrote this report. Ayantola, Samuel, and Leah are listed as the primary authors of the report, but behind the scenes, there were so many other contributors as well. Salam Wait, my colleague Rachel Adams, Magafli from Miss Alami. They put in quite a lot of work into this report, and I'm quite grateful for their efforts in producing this. It is critical to recognize whether broader technology visions are limited to governmental and private sector imaginations, or whether they also capture the lived realities and visions of the public. The very means through which emerging technologies are envisioned to leapfrog systemic challenges, shows an area of concern. For example, through the smartification of cities, as Zambia intends to do without sufficient consideration attributed to the threats of data vesting or mechanisms in place to curb the social impact of private companies. So without foregrounding the environmental and labor repercussions that we discuss in the report, the leveraging of mineral resources also foreshadows potential significant social costs to technological enhancements. Basic infrastructure and connectivity shortcomings, as various speakers have discussed today, pose a major barrier to technology adoption across different countries on the continent, not just the 5 countries we look at. And the report lays bare the existence of frameworks pertaining to emerging technologies and issues related to them only reveal a portion of the overall reality, where regulations are dispersed, where the public is unaware of their existence, or institutions are not well equipped to translate them into lived rights. The notion of digital democracy is compromised. So we need to keep pushing for uniform governance approaches at an African Union level, making sure that we limit the fragmentation that we are seeing across emerging various technology policies. And we need to build on strong foundational policies that we are seeing coming out of various countries, data protection laws, cybersecurity laws, IP laws, so that we have this coordinated approach towards a truly responsive technology policies on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fola, and thank you to all our panelists for such a thoughtful and engaging conversation. I think the insights shared today reinforce the importance of shaping technology policies that are inclusive, rights-based, and forward-thinking, but also the need to improve the basics, establishing them, such as proper infrastructure, digital skills, connectivity, etc. And of course, we encourage everyone to download and read the full report to continue this important conversation. Thank you all for being part of this session, and I will hand over to Iria for the closing remarks. Thank you. Iria, your mic is off.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Aisha. I want to thank the audience for attending the launch of the report, Emerging Technology Policies and Democracy in Africa, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and Zambia in focus. I would like to thank Fola Adeleke for presenting the highlights of the report, Aisha for moderating the conversation and raising critical questions, to partners organizations, Paradigm Initiative, CIPESA, Research ICT Africa, and Global Center for on AI Governance, and the African experts Lilian Alwoga, Julian Nafuka, Liz Orembo, Kandija Osman, Shidi Misbili Mutati, and Miriam Beatriz Mayuri for sharing their insights on the critical issues of artificial intelligence and TPI governance. The report offers valuable opportunities for policymakers, researchers, civil society actors, and technology experts to engage in critical issues surrounding technology governance in Africa. It promotes a right-aligned approach to technology regulation and accountability, while also exploring the role of major tech companies in Africa. The list of stakeholders for countries is especially valuable. I want you to take a look at that particular part of the report. We encourage you to download and read the full report to further explore the findings and the recommendations discussed today. Thank you very much.